Hello and welcome back to another episode of Future Frame TV. I'm Elise Krozer, your host for the Inequalities channel presented by Traces.Dreams. And I'm here today to talk about inequalities in relation to issues of violence, education, and youth. And for that, we have an expert on the link between violence, education, and youth, how these are connected to inequalities, and that is Cirenia Chavez. Cirenia is a PhD from development, or has a PhD, a doctorate degree from development studies from the University of Cambridge. She's been working for different entities within the UN, including UNDP, Unicef, several others, where she's a consultant on these subjects and others. She's here today with us in her capacity as a researcher, so independently of that work, to talk to us a little bit about these issues in Mexico. Welcome to the program, Cirenia.
Thanks, Alice. Just to remind, of course, our listeners that, whatever position I express doesn't really reflect or may not reflect the views of any of the organizations that I have worked with and are affiliated to, just to clarify.
Perfect.
Thanks for having me.
We are very happy to have you, and we're very excited to learn about your thesis project, which is a project that you have been working on for a long time, where you investigated the relationship of youth offenders in northern Mexico and their social backgrounds. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found, what you did, and what you found in your research there?
Yeah, sure. So essentially, my research question was geared towards understanding why young men in a specific area of Mexico, in the north of Mexico, participated in organized crime. So, of course, it's a very complex question, and there is a belief that money, economic constraints, is a major motivation for their participation. But of course, as with everything, the answer is much more complex. So, in order to understand how and why this happened, I engaged in kind of intense fieldwork for a period of 10 months. I was based in Ciudad Juarez, which is a city in the northern border of Mexico and the US that has become, or has been for a couple of decades, one of the main smuggling routes of drugs crossing from Mexico to the United States. So I was there for 10 months, and during this period of time, I basically conducted 360 surveys, that was my sample size, with young men who had participated in organized crime. So half of the sample were young men aged between 12 and 29, which is the age that Mexico considers as youth, who were serving prison sentences at the time of my field work. And I can talk a little bit more about their characteristics and the details, but essentially it was this age group. And they were serving prison sentences for different types of crimes associated to organized criminal activity. And then I surveyed another 180 young men in the same age group, coming from the same areas of the city where the young men who were in prison also lived before they were in prison. But these young men didn't have any background in terms of offending. So this was my sort of control sample to compare the two. So I was there for 10 months. I did all of these surveys, and I also conducted 20 in-depth interviews with a subsample, so a smaller group of the young men who were serving prison sentences, to sort of get a more comprehensive understanding of their lives and what they had been through before they participated in organized crime. So in a nutshell, that was what the field work was and consisted of. So I'm happy to answer more questions about that.
Yeah, I'm very interested, of course, in knowing a little bit more about the characteristics maybe that differentiate these two groups, if there were any, or what other explanatory hypotheses you have as to why some of them coming from the same in question marks background end up in one condition or in a different one.
So essentially, what I asked them, I had a very long survey, a very long questionnaire that I administered to all of these participants. And this survey touched upon different aspects of their life. So I asked them about their educational background. I asked them about their family life. I asked them about their aspirations, about what they wanted and expected of the future. I asked them also a little bit about their socioeconomic background, what were sort of the conditions in their households, how were they living, not just what kind of income they had or whether they were poor or not, but a more sort of comprehensive understanding of what their socioeconomic background looked like. And I found really interesting differences. So despite the fact that both groups sort of essentially resided in the same types of neighborhoods, there were important differences. So, for example, amongst those young men who were in prison and who had offended, a large portion of them, a large share of them, had grown up in single parent households. So, with fathers who were not absent. And that ended up being something that really
there.
Yeah, who were not there, who were either absent, as in, sometimes sporadically they would appear and maybe spend some time with their sons. I don't know if I mentioned this, but I only worked with males. I didn't work with women because despite the fact that we know, of course, that women are involved in organized crime in different capacities, it is predominantly a male issue. And I can talk a little bit more about this maybe after I answer this question. But yeah, so I only worked with men. And I found that, yes, they mostly grew up with fathers who were either not present at all, who had made their mothers pregnant and then just left, or they were there, but maybe every couple of 6 months or something, they would visit. But just to say, they didn't have a strong bond or relationship with their sons. And that was a key difference between the offender sample, to explain it in simple terms. I know it's more complicated than that. And the non-offender sample, who did appear to have more, I wouldn't say wholesome families, but they did have father figures who were present and around. So that was one key difference. Another important difference that I found is that a lot of the young men who had offended and who were serving prison sentences, a large share of them had dropped out of school, and they had dropped out of school quite early, a lot of them at the secondary level. And I had asked I had a module in my survey asking sort of about their educational experiences because I wanted to understand, what it was that made them have such a negative experience in school that led them to drop out. Was it about poverty? What was it that, drove them to leave? And I realized that because both samples were similar in many ways and their socioeconomic background was also quite similar, it actually wasn't poverty that was explaining this difference, because the non-offender sample had actually stayed in school longer than the offender sample. And one of the key things that I found is that there was a general disillusionment with education. It's not that, and I wouldn't say that they dropped out. I argued in one of the articles that I published with a colleague of mine that it's actually a school system that sort of pushes them out. So I had a lot of young men who told me that, in the beginning when they were kids and they were young, they actually tended to do really well in school. Like, they would get good grades. They liked school. They enjoyed going. But then as they sort of hit their teenage years, they started, it's not that they weren't smart or that they couldn't do the work. It's just that their behavior wasn't appropriate to the standards and the rules of the school. So a lot of them ended up being expelled from the school system, And in the end, it ends up being a situation where the fact that they are expelled brings out in them an attitude of saying like, well, you're not expelling me. I'm not interested anymore. So it gives them a little bit of agency to say, it's not me. The school is quitting on me, so I quit on the school. And that's it. That's the end. And I didn't see that with the non-offending sample of young people that I worked with. They had stayed in school. Some of them had gone on to university and tertiary education, So that was one key difference. However, I will say that when I asked the young men in prison about their aspirations and about what they valued in life, a lot of them mentioned that they actually valued a good education. So that was really interesting to see. And I concluded that probably the time that they have spent in prison, they have had a kind of process of reflection where they now understand the value. But at the time when they were young and when they decided to quit, the circumstances were really different. So that all to say, their experiences in school were not ideal. And that just led to a general disillusionment with the system. And they eventually got pushed out instead of voluntarily choosing to drop out of school. And this has, of course, important policy implications for many reasons. And we can talk about that more after we discuss this. But yeah, so that was the second key difference. And the third main thing that I would say that I found is that within the offending sample, there was definitely a higher value placed on material goods than in the non-offender sample. And I mean, it's understandable, and this links to inequality. Mexico is a very unequal country, as probably anybody familiar with the topic of inequality knows. And living in the border, particularly, puts young people faced with a much more starker form of inequality. So the area where I was working with these young men, and where I was carrying out my surveys, you could actually see the UTEP campus. So UTEP is the University of Texas in El Paso. You could physically see the campus from the poor area where I was collecting data. And so these young men are exposed to that on a daily basis, right? So there was definitely an element of some of these young men wanting to have access to material goods that, if they did not participate in the drug trade, there was just no reasonable way that they could ever get their hands on these types of things. And it's interesting because the young men who were in prison, they were not necessarily coming from backgrounds of extreme poverty. So they said it themselves, there was enough to eat, their necessities were met, but they wanted something more. And a job in the formal sector, for example, in an assembly plant, which is where a lot of the both offenders and non-offenders had worked, did not provide the type of salary that would allow them to have access to those things. And it's not just about having those things, it's about what those things represent. Those things are tied to status. It defines who you are. If you have access to something like luxury clothing, to say, or a brand clothing, to say something, it's not just about having that brand clothing, but having that brand clothing means that you are someone. And they all wanted to be someone and to be recognized as people who are worthy of value. And Mexico is a country where this is the way things work, and they know that, and they're aware. And so they wanted to be recognized. So I would say that those are the three main areas where I saw important differences between one group and the other. And it's not that the other group didn't attach any value to material goods. They did, but not to the same extent. So
it's a lot about the opportunities that you have or rather lack at a certain crucial moment when you are capacitated to do something, but you don't have any means to develop those capacities or to explore them, right? And sure. I mean, that links perfectly well to your already hinted at point of policy implications, right? Or what would be a way to cut these vicious circles?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's, from a policy perspective, there's many ways to tackle this issue, but definitely one important thing is education policy. So this idea that it's okay to expel students who don't behave rather than support them. I mean, of course, we understand that teachers, especially in Mexico, are sometimes overburdened, and maybe they don't have the pedagogic tools to be able to understand kids that are coming from difficult environments, difficult households. As I said, some of them, were part of single parent households. Perhaps teachers are not capacitated to deal with those kinds of learners, but it's essential to try to keep kids in school, because at the moment the school decides to expel them, it's basically sending them so to speak, to the arms of organized crime. It doesn't mean that because a student is expelled, he will automatically be a part of that. But if this is occurring in an environment where there is an opportunity crime structure, then there is a high likelihood that that's what they're going to do, because what other choice do they have? Their only other choice is to work in the assembly plant. And by the way, a lot of these young men did. So they were double shifting. They were working in the assembly plant and they were selling drugs, because that's the way that you get by. I will say also, and I forgot to mention this in one of the key differences, is that a lot of the young men in serving prison sentences had families when they were really young. So they also had that added pressure that it wasn't just about, them being able to access material goods, but they also had a family to provide for. And most of the times when they were able to get significant income from organized criminal activities, mostly drug dealing, they would use that money for their own families or to support extended family members. That was a very crucial aspect of their expenditures. Yeah.
There definitely is something about the particularity of the place, right? You already mentioned that the closeness to the US facilitates certain business branches, including the trafficking of diverse goods and services and the visual impact of inequality, etc. But what was your experience of being on the ground there? I mean, this sort of embedded field work of living there. You are yourself from a northern state, but not Ciudad Juarez. What was your experience of living in this context and of interacting with these families and with these youth?
I have to say that it was in many ways a really enriching experience, because even though I come from the north, I come from the northeast. And to me, the Northwest seems to be fundamentally different in many ways. So I would see a kind of togetherness and spirit of solidarity in these communities that I never saw in the northeastern part where I'm coming from. So that was definitely one aspect of it. But also Ciudad Juarez is much closer to the border than where I come from, which is Monterrey is about 2 hours and a half from the border. So it's not border culture for us, whereas for them it is. A lot of them are actually able to cross the border every day. Some of them work in the US. So it really is a porous situation where the two cultures sort of come together, for better or for worse. So yeah, I do think that the levels of inequality that you see in the West and in Juarez in particular are much more stark, because you're also seeing what's happening in the US. So it's not just, the inequality that exists within Mexican society. You're also seeing the inequality that exists between poor Mexicans, wealthy Mexicans, but also Americans. So yeah, it's quite an interesting dynamic. In terms of my experience working with the young men in prison, it was a difficult experience, because I don't want to justify them, and I've fallen into that trap where people say that I'm justifying crimes that maybe shouldn't be justified, but I have tried to understand, and I think that seeing their circumstances in prison and understanding a little bit of their background, I can say that, yeah, perhaps if I had been in those circumstances, perhaps if I had grown up that way, who's to say that my decisions would not have been the same as theirs? It's highly probable. We like to think that we would never do something, but in reality, we didn't grow up in those circumstances, so we can't know. Yeah, it was a hard experience, but also a very enriching one. Yeah, I learned a lot.
Can you say something a little more maybe about these young men in the offender samples? I know that some of them have been multiple offenders, and I remember you were saying people have had many lives on their count, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little more how the interaction with these men goes about in practice, considering specifically what you said before, that everybody wants to just be someone and be themselves, and how normalized can a conversation, or how normal can a conversation even be under those circumstances, and how can you approach something like that, knowing as you do that there are certain circumstances behind also that, as you say, we don't know how we would have reacted in any other situation than the one we are in.
Sure. I mean, I would say that I came to this fieldwork experience having had no experience interacting with people in prison. This was the first time that I set out to carry out an exercise like that. So I didn't know what the outcome was going to be. I was actually quite nervous, but I think there were several things that facilitated the interaction between us. The first one is that I had a team that was working with me. So because we had to complete such a large sample of surveys, I mean, large for the amount of time that we had, and we only had permission to be in the prison for 2 weeks, it wasn't really possible for me to conduct all the surveys myself. So it was me and an additional team of 3 people. And so that team of researchers actually had quite extensive experience conducting surveys in prison. They have helped carry out the first nationwide surveys in federal prisons. So they know this. And before we actually went to the prison, they had a few recommendations about, how to facilitate the conversation, what kind of relationship we had to develop, not just with the inmates, but also with the prison wardens, who are, key figures. They are the gatekeepers, the ones who give you access to the people that you want to talk to. So having a good relationship with them is essential for the fieldwork to actually be effective. So the first day I was very, very nervous. I didn't know what things were going to be like, but the first person I sat down with, it was such a positive experience. And I think that part of what made it so positive was that a lot of these people had not had the chance to talk to anybody in a long time. Some of them have maybe family members who visit every now and then. Some of the lucky ones have people who visit them often. But I don't think that they are able to engage in conversations about their lives to this extent. And to have an outsider, I'm also aware of my positionality very much. So I'm a Mexican, I'm a woman, I'm young, I'm a researcher. For them, it's somebody that they would never think would have any interest in them. So they were very much willing to share. And I remember even one of them saying something like, this is the first time that I had ever said this to anybody, or that I had talked about this to anyone. So obviously it's not that I was myself doing them a favor. I was doing research. Obviously I later wrote my thesis and I needed their data. But it speaks volumes to the fact that they don't really have anybody to share anything with. They don't talk about these issues, and nobody has taken the time to ask them, which is a shame because, you were asking me about policy, but for example, in terms of prisoner rehabilitation, you know that jails in Mexico, prisons in Mexico are called rehabilitation centers. Well, people don't really get rehabilitated there. And despite the fact that policemen have such a rich source of information with these people and that they don't use it, seems like such a shame. You want policy advice? Talk to them. They actually have good recommendations. One of the questions that I asked the men that I interviewed was, what policy recommendations do you have? What do you think, not policy recommendations, I asked them specifically, what do you think the government should do so that young men like you who might be tempted to participate in these kinds of activities, how do you think the government can help them? And they had pretty coherent answers, but no one has ever taken the time to ask them these things. So yeah, it was, to my surprise, a very, very positive experience. And most of the interactions that we had were very positive. I will say that another thing that I think helped a lot is that we didn't really go into details of their crimes. They talked to me about these things on their own. I didn't ask them, because that wasn't the point of the research. I sort of wanted to understand everything about their lives before they started to become engaged in these kinds of activities. So it wasn't part of my survey and it wasn't part of my questionnaire to prod into that aspect of their lives. I did receive some of this information, but not because I asked. So I think this set up a good sort of working relationship from the beginning, because we weren't discussing topics that, might have been sensitive to them, or that they might have been afraid that some of the information that we discussed got out. I didn't ask them about that. I told them explicitly that if, of course, they wanted to share something else with me, they could, but I didn't ask those questions. And I, in retrospect, I know there could have been very interesting information that I could have collected about that, but it was absolutely, and I think morally, the right thing to do not to ask about that.
Even methodologically, probably the right thing to do. I mean, also people, if they don't want to talk about something, then they'll just stop talking. And I know from experience in interviews. I'm wondering, how did you, Cirenia, get involved in this kind of research interest in the first place? Or, I mean, what made you think about these issues?
Monterrey, where I come from, was also a very strategic city in terms of the drug trade, because it's located close to the border, not as close as Juarez, but it's still close. And in 2010, there was an increase in a very high increase in homicides tied to organized criminal violence. And so I was working at a newspaper back then, and we started to see instances of, horrific violence where bodies were hanging on pedestrian bridges. There were shootouts in random places of the city. Some of my own friends were caught in the crossfire between, two rival groups. And of course, there's a whole history and a whole background as to why that happened. But the point was that all of a sudden the city became quite unsafe, which, it might have been in certain areas of the city, but essentially the middle class had not been exposed to that kind of violence until that point. And I think there was just a general realization that it could happen to anybody, whether you were tied to organized crime or not. It had gotten to the level that insecurity was so high that you as a student, as whoever you were, could be caught in the middle of that violence. And so in 2011, I left Mexico to do my master's degree, and I received a call that one of my good friends from childhood, I had been out of touch with him for a long time, but then we saw each other before I left to do my master's. And I had been to his house and, seen his family, and it was really nice. So I received news that his mom, who I had just seen, had passed away. She, essentially, one of these organized criminal groups lit a casino on fire in revenge because the casino owner had not paid piso. So, the tax that organized crime charges to people who are operating on their territory. So the owner of the casino had not paid the piso, and the casino was burned down with the people who were there playing the slots inside. And so several people died, and amongst them my friend's mom. And so I had this immediate urge to sort of, I wanted to do something. And because my superpower or my skill is to do research, and that's what I'm good at, I thought, this is something that's worth researching. And I don't know how else to help but to do this. Hopefully this will do some good, and maybe I can come up with concrete policy recommendations that can later be shared to sort of, I know the situation isn't going to change overnight, but to start to tackle some of the smaller issues that, that can be addressed. And that was how I initially got interested. And then I started working with UNDP for the Regional Bureau of Latin America and the Caribbean, where we were publishing a couple of research briefs on youth and youth at risk. And so this further sparked my interest, but also sort of refined my topic and what I wanted to do. And so once I left UNDP, I had a very clear idea of what my research question was and how I could go about answering that research question. So that's sort of the origin story of why I decided to do this.
Yeah, I remember the first day of of PhD when we met and you already knew your research question as opposed to everybody else. That was impressive. Cirenia, before we come to a close, what do you think would be areas where we need more data or more information, where it would be worthwhile to research in these subjects so that we could comprehend better the situation and hopefully change it?
Yeah, thanks, Alice. That's a really good question. I mean, I think it's always worthwhile to do more of this type of research, and especially with populations and with young men particularly who are serving prison sentences. I think it's definitely a group of people who have been largely ignored in society. I know that there have been surveys done in prison, like very large scale surveys, but they haven't really focused on this very specific area. It's been a more like sort of broader effort to kind of understand all offending populations. But I do think that further research needs to be done with this specific subset of prison population. And I'm a mixed methods researcher, but I definitely do think that there needs to be more of an effort from the qualitative side to sort of talk to some of these people much more in depth. I wasn't able to do that. I only interviewed 20 people. I said I did more surveys because that's the method that I chose to go with. But definitely, I think more qualitative work is worthwhile. Ethnographic work, obviously, you can't do it in prison, but you can live within the communities, and understand sort of the families and those dynamics that I didn't get a chance really to explore. That's also an area that I think needs further investigation for sure. Yeah.
Cirenia, thank you so much for sharing these insights with us. Anything that you would like to add specifically at this point that we haven't talked about?
No, I think that, if anybody is interested in pursuing this sort of line of work, if they're doing it now and if they're one of your listeners or if they're thinking about it and they want to get in touch, then they definitely should, because I have material to share that, they could build on, and I'm always happy to do that. I've published several articles that I'm happy to share, mostly academic articles, but even then, if you try to access them online, you have to pay. So if you just ask me, I can just send them to you and share. And I'm happy if at least this work receives a little bit more traction than just, staying within academia and having just very few people read it. Yeah.
I think that's a wonderful idea, suggestion, and offer. And thank you so much for sharing these wonderful insights with us. And we hope you might be interested in learning more. Take Cirenia up on her offer of sharing her research, which is wonderful, which is terrible, but very good research. Take her up on her offer of sharing it with you if you're interested in these subjects. Cirenia and I would like to dedicate this specific episode to the memory of our friend and co-student at Cambridge University, Giulio Regeni, who was killed in Egypt some years ago under very terrible circumstances. So violence does also even affect researchers that look into such subjects. If you want to know more, there's information on the internet, or we are also happy to share information on his case with you if you're interested. We would like to thank you for joining us for this episode and learning more about violence and its relation with inequalities in northern Mexico, its relation with education, especially for the youth of the region. And if you like the topic of inequalities, or if you would like to learn more about them, please join us again next Saturday for another episode of Future Frame TV. And I'm Alice Krozer, your host for the Inequalities channel. I hope to see you again there next time. Have a nice day. Thank you. Bye-bye.